Now, I did that with my own kids when it came to certain beliefs like Santa or the Easter Bunny. And then some will say, oh, but you're robbing them of that mystical feeling of magic land. You know, what do you say to that? Like, oh, let me have that for my kid to teach them that stuff.
Strangely, that was the most common question I got when I wrote this short book, Lying, where I argue very stridently that you should more or less never lie, that you should think about lying as the least violent thing you can do in self-defense. So you should put it on the continuum of violence. But in normal relationships where you are dealing with someone who's rational, who is conceivably on your team, who's not trying to harm you overtly, well then I think lying is more or less always unethical, even so-called white lies. So I got a lot of pushback against this, but the most common, by a factor of 10, was, what about Santa? What about... And,
surely that's the one lie we can still get away with, right, Sam?
And I also heard from many people who remembered what it was like to realize that their parents had been lying to them about Santa, and they remember the harm it did to their view of their parents. They were carrying around this wound. But I mean, as far as Santa's concerned, it's like it's this one thing that, I mean, it's already the best holiday, right? It's already the most fun. You get presents. We have no temptation to lie about other things that are fictional and fun. I mean, you don't have to tell kids that Harry Potter really exists to get them into the Harry Potter story, or the Lord of the Rings, and Halloween is fun. You don't have to say there really are witches and ghosts, and it's just that you don't have to juice a child's capacity for finding fiction fun. But the deeper issue with lying is, honestly, I have only once found myself lying to my oldest daughter. She's about to turn 9, and it was totally inadvertent. We did a Google search of something. She was about 5 or 6, and the images are coming up. And if you're a parent, you know what this is like. You don't know what the hell is going to come up. And actually, so this is a digression, but my daughter just asked. She has to ask permission for Google searches because she's looking. She got really into iMovie, and she needs to find still photos for her movies. And so she said, "Can I do a Google search for schoolgirls?" And it took me about 5 seconds to realize how bad that was going to go. So anyway, but we did this Google search, and an image of what was like a 14th century woodcut image of a witch being killed by the Inquisition, and in this case, having his or her head cut off, came up. But it was as benign a version of that as possible. It was just this old woodcut, and I'm scrolling past it, and she stops me. She says, "What was that?" And I just didn't have enough time to tell my version of the truth here, so I wound up saying, that was a very old and impractical form of surgery. But honestly, that is the one lie I've told my daughter. I've never found it necessary to lie to her. And so everything that I would want to impart as far as critical thinking or skepticism with respect to specific ideas, all of that's just coming in, by osmosis. I mean, she just gets all of it. I mean, she has the tools now, and she's not even 9.
Yeah, my mother regretted, even as a Christian, telling me about Santa, because when I did find out the truth, I was probably 8 or 9, as soon as she told me, I immediately went, oh, so Jesus is fake too. She was horrified.
I've heard from many people who've had that experience.
She was horrified. And so I've always thought, you lie to your kids about the Easter Bunny, you lie to your kids about Santa Claus, you lie to your kids about the Tooth Fairy, and then you're shocked when they're 13 and they start lying to you. Like, where do you think they're getting this from? So I want to instill, what we've done in my home, my kids are much older now, but what we've done in my home is just encouraged pretend, but we call it pretend.
Right.
I mean, to this day, my kids are 13 and 17, and I'll still write from Santa on the package, and I'll never admit to buying it, but of course they know better. The same with the Tooth Fairy. We tell them it's pretend, but we continue to pretend. And I think that's a way to sort of, like you were saying, inspire that awe and wonder in the mystical realm, but understand it is what it is. So how can we then take that, allow them to have that pretend time, but encourage and inspire the science? I mean, obviously, we're not going to teach evolution to kindergartners. There's got to be a barrier. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how we can inspire very, very young kids?
Well, I think it's just a commitment to giving every appropriate and fascinating truth whenever it's relevant. So that you have to calibrate what you say to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old, but there's some appropriate version of the truth that is potentially fascinating. I'm not under any illusions that every kid will be equally interested in science. It's just not, and heavy-handed attempts to make them more interested than they are, natively in any given moment, just at least if you're their father, doesn't work very well. You just have to make it, you have to represent your interests honestly, and again, it's just if you're never tempted to lie, or if you are tempted, if you become skeptical of that motivation, it all just keeps finding its way into the conversation, and then you're dealing with a child who, again, at a very young age, is still is running some version of a reality check that is fairly adult, and which many adults never manage to get online. It's like there's a kind of there's a pause before believing certain things, and it just kind of a checking operation that is it's very surprising to me to see it in somebody so young. But that is the basis of science.
We're all so interested in having our opinions heard and sort of being an outward flow of information that when a child asks a question, we so badly want to just say, here's the answer, or this is what I think is the case. And I think a great response that I've heard from a lot of people is they just say to the child, what do you think? Even some very liberal Christians who will talk to me and say, I appreciate the conversations you have, I appreciate your respectful approach, but I think you're wrong. I'll ask them, what do you say to your kid when they say, was Jesus born of a virgin, or does God exist? Some of them are starting to tell me, they're saying, I don't know, what do you think? And they're letting the kid explore these ideas. And to your point, what I did with my daughter is I would teach her about Jesus as a kid, but we would also teach her about Thor and Demeter and Zeus. And she sort of learned about religion in this overall concept of different religions. And we left out, of course, the beheadings and that impractical form of surgery you talked about. But we did sort of explain religion in that concept.
And the first part of what you said is also relevant. To be able to say, I don't know, maybe grown-ups are very uncomfortable saying that to their kids, it seems. And
you think they don't want to appear weak in front of their kids? They want to appear as this. I mean, look, they're going to find out eventually that you're not perfect, and so I think being able to say I don't know is.
Yeah, but you can just flip it. I don't know is the doorway to everything that's worth finding out. I mean, it is the basis of curiosity. And I mean, my wife Annika wrote a children's book about this entitled "I Wonder." I mean, it was motivated directly by this experience of just seeing our daughter pretend to know things that she obviously didn't know, and we realized that we had never taught her that it was okay to say I don't know. Like there was nothing embarrassing about not knowing. And then the pendulum swung the other way, and she would say I don't know to every question, like she was one of our hostages in Vietnam, just giving name, rank, and serial number and answering nothing. But now we're back in some sane place.
I can imagine your kids. That would be so much fun. Is your room clean? Well, what is clean, Dad? Is anything ever really clean?
there, I'm sure.
I'm sure. So speaking of children, we've heard these horrific stories of, a child being sick or in some way in need of medical care, and fundamentalist parents laying hands on the child or praying for the child and neglecting the medical treatment. And a lot of times, at least in the States, what happens is the government will say there's nothing we can do at the time because, that's your religious freedom. But once the child dies, then they can say, okay, well, you neglected them from medical treatment or something else. They won't kick in the door and take the child for medical care, even if it's a preventable or curable disease or sickness. But they will, after the fact, say, okay, well, you neglected to provide that child with medical treatment. And so obviously there's this blurred line between religious freedoms and protecting someone from religious hurt and harm. So we all probably have different lines. I want to start with you, Sarah. Where do you draw that line between people having the freedom to express their own religion and practice their own religion, and then preventing a child from being harmed? Even something small like, for example, Amish will often take their children out of school at like second grade and say, that's enough learning for you, get on the farm and start working. There's different levels of harm. Where do you draw that line?
Well, it's easy to make the distinction in some cases. Like if you were to look at the female genital mutilation cases that are coming out of Michigan, and they're finding that there have been girls, 100 girls or so, that have been cut in Michigan, in the United States, and they're going through and they're trying to prosecute the doctors who performed the operations. And I think in those cases it's an easy call to make. It's easy to say that, well, this is a child is a human being and they have the right to their bodily integrity, and very clearly their bodily integrity has been harmed or even destroyed in some cases, depending on how bad the actual cut was. So I think it's easy to make the case in something like that. It's harder when you look at something like the hijab, which I find to be quite harmful. I find it to be something that really just instills this sense of shame in a young woman about her body and about her sexuality. So it's very easy for me to argue that this is harmful too. But I'm uncomfortable with saying that parents should not be allowed to request or even push their children to wearing a hijab.
Let me ask you there about the hijab. Aren't there some women who find sort of a sense of pride in wearing it, so that if you were to try to say, I find that harmful, I'm going to fight for you not to have to wear this, would you get some pushback from women within Islam that'll say, excuse me, I find this as a rite of passage, or this is a symbol of my connection to God, or something along those lines, where they don't want to be protected from that and they find it offensive that you find the hijab offensive?
Well, I mean, anytime you talk about banning anything, you run the risk of turning it into from a religious symbol to a political symbol, and then it becomes almost more powerful. In a lot of ways, it does become more powerful because people who might not be religious to begin with might wear the hijab out of solidarity because they feel like this is that their Muslim brothers and sisters or their civil liberties are being infringed upon. So they will do it out of this sense of solidarity, and that's terrible because what it does is it covers up the actual harm that's taking place and the religious justification, which we need to talk about and we need to discuss and we need to understand why it's so harmful and why. Do
you think it's abusive for a parent to have their child wear a hijab? Is it?
It's interesting because I can definitely say it's harmful, but whether abuse is different because to some extent it has this connotation where the parent is trying to harm the child in some way. And I don't know if that's the case. And in fact, many Muslim parents, they think that they're protecting their girls. They think they're doing what's best for them. They think they're going to set them up for life once they've taught them the values of modesty. So is it abuse from that perspective? I don't know, but it definitely does have a harm.
Well, it's also confused by the fact that in many cases they're right about how their daughters will be treated in the community by Muslim boys and men if they don't wear the hijab. So they are protecting them from abuse in in that
in that
particular
context,
yeah.
and that's absolutely true. That it's a rational decision to protect your child, not just from the hereafter and what God is going to do there, but the way that they're going to be treated in this life here and now. So, from that perspective, you can even look at many Muslim homes. A lot of ex-Muslims that I talk to, women especially, the ones that were forced into hijab, and they'll talk about how it was their mothers who forced them to wear the hijab, who enforced these sort of codes on them, these modesty codes on them, who made them feel ashamed about their sexual urges. But if you look at it from the perspective of the mother is trying to protect somebody who she cares about very much, and she wants to make sure that her daughter has every option open to her, within that society. So it's a tricky thing.